Eastern North Carolina Radio Reading Service, a United Wavy Partner agency. We welcome you to this program entitled Off the Bookshelf. Your reader is Nehemiah Suber, and I'll be reading Slavery by Another Name, written by Douglas A. Black. Introduction. On March 30th, 1908, Green Cottonham was arrested by the sheriff of Shelby County, Alabama, and charged with vagrancy. Cottonham had committed no true crime. Vagrancy, the offense of a person not being able to prove at a given moment that he or she is employed, was a new and flimsy competition dreaded up from the legal obscurities at the end of the 19th century by the state legislatures of Alabama and other southern states. It was compressively enforced by local sheriff and constables, adjusted by mayors and notaries public. Recorded haphazardly or not all in court records, and most telling in a time of massive unemployment among all Southern men, was reserved almost exclusively for black men. Cottonham's offense was blackness. After 3 days behind bars, 22-year-old Cottonham was found guilty with a swift appearance before the county judge and immediately sentenced to a 30-day term of hard labor, unable to pay for the array of fees assessed on every prisoner. Fees to the sheriff, the deputies, the court clerks, the witnesses. Cottonham's sentence was extended to nearly a year of hard labor. The next day, Cottonham, the youngest of 9 children born to former slaves in an adjoining county, was sold under a standing arrangement between the county and a vast subsidiary of Industrial Titans of North, the U.S. Steel Corporation. The sheriff turned the young man over to the company for the duration of his sentence. In return, the subsidiary Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company gave the county $12 a month to pay off Cottonham's fine and fee. What the company's manager did with Cottonham and thousands of other black men they purchased from sheriffs across Alabama was entirely up to them. A few hours later, the company plunged Cottonham into the darkness of a mine called Slope Number 12, one shaft in a vast subterranean labyrinth on the edge of Birmingham, known as the Pratt Mine. There he was, chained inside a long wooden barrack at night, and required to spend nearly every waking hour digging and loading coal. His required daily task was to remove 8 tons of coal from the mine. Cottonham was subject to the whip for failure to dig the requisite amount, at risk of physical torture for disobedience, and vulnerable to the sexual predation of other miners, many of whom already had past years or decades in their own confinement. The lightless catacombs of black rocks, packed with hundreds of desperate men, slick with sweat and coated with pulverized coal, may have exceeded any vision of a boy born in the countryside of Alabama. Even a child of slave could have ever imagined. Waves of disease ripped through the population. In the month before Cottonham's arrival at the prison, pneumonia and tuberculosis sickened dozens. Within his first 4 weeks, 6 died. Before the year was over, almost 60 men forced into Slope 12 were dead of disease, accidents, or homicide. Most of the broken bodies, along with hundreds of others before and after, were dumped into shallow graves scattered among the refuse of the mine. Others were centered in nearby ovens used to blast millions of tons of coal brought to the surface into coke. The carbon-rich fuel essential to U.S. steel production of iron. 45 years after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freeing American slaves, Green Cottenham and more than 1,000 other black men told under the Lash Act Slope 12. Imprisoned in what was then the most advanced city of the South, guarded by whipping bosses employed by the most iconic example of the modern corporation emerging into glided north. They were slaves in all but name. Almost a century later, on a overgrown hillside 5 miles from the bustling downtown of contemporary Birmingham, I found my way to one of the only tangible relics of what Green Cottenham endured. The ground was all but completely obscured by the dense thicket, but beneath the underground of the privet, the faint outline of hundreds upon hundreds of oval desperations still marked the land, spread in haphazard across the forest floor. These were sunken graves of the dead from nearby prison mines, once operated by U.S. Steel. Here and there, Antediluvian headstones jutted from the foliage. No signs marked the place, no path led to it. I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, exploring the possibilities of a story, asking a provocative question. What would be revealed if American corporations were examined through the same sharp lens of historical confirmation as the one then being trained on German corporation that relied on Jewish slave labor during World War II, and the Swiss banks that robbed victims of the Holocaust of their fortune. My guide that day in the summer of 2000 was an industrial archaeologist named Jack Bergstresser. Years earlier, he had stumbled across a simple iron fence surrounding a single collapsed grave during a survey of areas. Bergstresser was mystified by his presence at the center of what, at the beginning of the 20th century, was one of the busiest confluences of the industrial activity in the United States. The grave and the twisted wrought iron around it sat near what had been the intersection of two rail lines, and a complex of mine, coal processing facilities, and furnace in which thousands of men operated around the clock to generate millions of tons of coal and iron, all owned and operated by U.S. Steel at the height of its supremacy in American commerce. Bergstresser, who is white, told me he wondered if the dead here were forced laborers. He knew that African Americans had been compelled to work in Alabama mines prior to the Great Depression. His grandfather, once a coal miner himself, had told his story of a familiar burial field near the family place south of Birmingham. A year later, the journal published my long article chronicling the saga of that burial ground. No specific record of the interments survived, but mountains of archival evidence and the oral histories of old and dying African Americans nearby confirmed that most of the cemetery inhabitants had been inmates of the labor camp that operated for 3 decades on the hilltop above the graveyard. Later, I would discover atop a nearby rise, another burial field, where Green Cottonham almost certainly was buried. The camp had supplied tens of thousands of men over 5 decades to a succession of prison mines ultimately purchased by U.S. Steel in 1907. Hundreds of them had not survived. Nearly all were black men arrested and then leased by state and county government to U.S. Steel or the company it had acquired. Here and in scores of other similarity, crude graveyard, the final chapter of American slavery had been buried. It was a form of bondage distinctly different from that of the antebellum South, in that for most men, and the relatively few women drawn in, this slavery did not last a lifetime and did not automatically extend from one generation to the next. But it was nonetheless slavery, a system in which armies of free men guilty of no crime and entitled by law to freedom were compelled to labor without compensation, were repeatedly bought and sold, and were forced to do bidding of white masters through the regular application of extraordinary physical corruption. The article generated a response unlike anything I had ever experienced as a journalist. A deluge of emails, letters, and phone calls arrived. White readers, on the whole, reacted with somber praise for a sober documentation of a forgotten crime against African Americans. Some say it heightened their understanding of demands for reparation to the descendants of antebellum slaves. Only a few expressed shock. For most, it seemed to be an account of one more important but sadly predictable bullet point in the standards of indictment of historically white racism. During an appearance on National Public Radio on the day of publication, Bob Edwards, the interviewer, at one point said to me, "I guess it really is no surprise. The reactions of African Americans were altogether different. Repeatedly, they described how the article lifted a terrible burden that the story had in some way, partly because of its severity and presence on the front page of the nation's most conservative daily news, supplied an answer or part of one to a question so unnerving few dared ask it out loud. If not racial inferiority, what explains the inexplicably labor advance of African Americans in U.S. society in the century between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s? The anamorphous rhetoric of the struggle against segregation, the thin cinematic imagery of Ku Klux Klan boogeyman, even the horrifying still viewed visuals of lynching had never been a significant answer to these African Americans for hundreds of years. For 100 years of seemingly desolate submission by 4 million slaves freed in 1863, and their tens of millions of descendants. How had so large a population of Americans disappeared into a largely unrecorded oblivion of poverty and obscurity? They longed for a convincing explanation. I began to realize that beneath that cruelty lays a haunting worry within those readers, that there might be no answer. The African Americans perhaps were simply damned by the fate or doomed by unworthiness. For many black readers, the account of how a form of American slavery persisted into the 20th century, embraced by the U.S. economic system and abided at all levels of government, offered a concrete answer to that fear for the first time. As I began to research for this book, I discovered that while historians concur that the South's practice of leasing convicts was a horrid abuse of African Americans, it was also viewed by many as a side in larger suite of events in the racial evolution of the South. The brutality of the punishment received by African Americans was unjust, but not shocking in light of waves of petty crimes ostensibly committed by freed slaves and their descendants. According to many conventional historians, slaves were unable to handle the emotional complexities of freedom and have been conditioned by generations of bondage to become thieves. This thinking held that the system of leasing prisoners contributed to the intimidation of blacks in the era, but was not central to it. Sympathy for the victims, however brutally they had been abused, was tempered because, after all, they were criminals. Moreover, more historians concluded that the details of what really happened couldn't be determined. Official accounts couldn't be rigorously challenged because so few of the original records of the arrests and contracts under which black men were imprisoned and sold had survived. Yet, as I moved from one county courthouse to the next in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, I concluded that such assumptions were fundamentally flawed. That was a version of history reliant on a narrow range of official summaries and government archives created and archived by the most dubious sources. Southern whites who engineered and most directly profited from the system. It overlooked many of the most significant dimensions of the new forced labor, including the centrality of its role in the web. A restriction put into place to suppress black citizenship is concomitant relations to debt, peonage, and the worst form of sharecropping, and an exponentially large number of African Americans compelled its servitude through the most informed and tainted local courts. The laws passed to intimidate black men away from political participation were enforced by sending descendants into slave mines or forced labor camps. The judge and sheriff who sold convicts to giant corporate prison mines also leased even large number of African Americans to local farmers and allowed their neighbors and political supporters to acquire still more black laborers directly from their courtrooms. And because most scholarly studies dissected these events into separate narratives limited to each southern state, they minimized the collective effects of decision by hundreds of state and local county governments during at least a part of this period to sell blacks to commercial interests. I was also troubled by a sensibility in much of the conventional history of the era that these events were somehow inevitable. White animosity toward blacks was accepted as a wrong but logical extent of embellished racial views. Events were presented as having transpired as a result of large, seemingly unavoidable social and anthropomorphic shifts, rather than the specific decision and choices of individuals. What's more, African Americans were portrayed by historians as an almost static component of the U.S. society. Their leaders changed with each generation, but the mass of black Americans were depicted as if the freed slaves of 1863 were the same people still not free 50 years later. There was no acknowledgement of the efforts of cycle upon cycle of a malevolent defeat, of the injury of seeing one generation rise above the scope of poverty only to be indignantly crushed, of the impact of repeating tsunami of violence and obliterated opportunities on each new generation, of an ever-changing population outnumbered in persons and resources. Yet in the attics and basement of courthouse, Young County Jail, storage shed, and local historian society, I found a vast record of original documents and personal narratives revealing a very different version of events. In Alabama alone, hundreds of thousands of pages of public documents attest to the arrest of sequential sales and delivery of thousands of African Americans into mine, lumber camp, quarries, farmers, and factories. More than 30,000 pages related to debt slavery cases sit in the files of the Department of Justice at the National Archives. Although millions of mostly obscure entries in the public records offer details of a forced labor system on a monotonous enormity. Instead of thousands of true deeds and thugs drawn into the system over decades, the records demonstrated the capture and imprisonment of thousands of random indigenous citizens, almost always under the thinnest shimmers of probable cause or judicial process. The total number of workers caught in this nest had to have totaled more than 100,000 and perhaps more than twice that figure. Instead of evidence showing black crime waves, the original records of county jails indicated thousands of arrests for inconsistent charges for violations of law specifically written to intimidate blacks, changing employers without permission, vagrancy, riding freight cars without a ticket, engaging in sexual activity, or loud talk with white women. Repeatedly, the timing and scale of surges and arrests appeared more attuned to a rise and dip in the need for cheap labor than any demonstrable acts of crime. Hundreds of forced labor camps came to exist, scattered through the South, operated by state and county government, large corporations, small-town entrepreneurs, and provincial farmers. These bulging slave centers became a primary weapon of suppression of black aspiration, where mob violence or Ku Klux Klan terrorized black citizens periodically. The return of forced labor as a fixture in the black life ground pervasively into the daily life of far more African Americans. And the record is replete with episodes in which public leaders face a true choice between a path towards complete racial representation or some degree of modest civil equality. The emphatically chose the former farmers. These were not avoidable events driven by envision of force traditional in history. By 1900, the South's judicial system had been wholly reconfigured to make one of its primary purposes of correction of African Americans to comply with social customs and labor demands of whites. It was not coincidental that 1901 also marked the final full disenfranchisement of nearly all blacks throughout the South. Sentences were handed down by provincial judges, local mayors, and justices of the peace, often men in employ of the white business owners who relied on forced labor produced by the judgments. Dockets and trial records were inconsistently maintained. Attorneys were rarely involved on the side of blacks. Revenues for the neo-slavery poured the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in the treasuries of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, and South Carolina, where more than 70% of the black population in the United States live. It also became apparent how inextricably this quasi-slavery of the 20th century was rooted in the nascent industry slavery that had begun to flourish in the last year before the Civil War. The same men who built railroads with thousands of slaves and proselytized for the use of slaves in southern factories and mines in 1850 were also the first to employ forced African American labor in the 1870s. The South's highly evolved system and custom for leasing slaves from one farmer or factory to the next, bartering for the cost of slave, and wholesaling the retailing of slaves regenerated itself around convict leasing in the 1870s and 1880s. The brutal forms of physical punishment employed against prisoners in 1910 were the same as those used against slaves in 1840. The anger and desperation of the Southern whites that allowed such outrage in 1920 were rooted in the chaos and bitterness of 1866. These were the tendril of the unladdered new racial compact that suffocated the aspiration for freedom and among millions of American blacks as they approached the beginning of the 20th century. I began to understand an implicable account of the neo-slavery endured by Green Cottonham must begin much earlier than even the Civil War and would extend far beyond the end of his life. Most ominous was how plainly the record showed that in the face of the rising Southern white assault on the black independent, even as black leaders increasingly expressed profound despair and hundreds of aching requests for help poured into federal agencies in Washington, D.C., the vast majority of white Americans exhausted from the long debate over the role of blacks in U.S. society, conceded that the descendants of slaves in the South would have to accept the end of freedom. On July 31st, 1903, a letter to President Theodore Roosevelt arrived at the White House from Carrie Kinsey, a barely literate African-American woman in Bainbridge, Georgia. Her 14-year-old brother, James Robinson, had been abducted a year earlier and sold to a plantation. Local police would take no interest. Mr. President, wrote by Kinsley, struggling to overcome the literacy of her world. They won't let me have him. He has not done nothing for them to have him in chains. So I write to you for help. Like the vast majority of such pleas, her letter was slipped into a small rectangular box in the Department of Justice and tagged with a reference number, in this case 12,007. No further action was even recorded. Her letter lies today in the National Archive. A world in which the seizure and sale of a black man, even a black child, was viewed as neither criminal or extraordinary have emerged. Millions of black lives live in that shadow as forced laborers or their family members, or African Americans in terror of the system oppressed. The practice would not fully recede from their life until the dawn of World War II, when profound global forces began to touch the lives of black Americans for the first time since the era of the international abolition movement a century earlier prior to the Civil War. That the arc of Green Cunningham's life led from a birth in the heading afterglow of emancipation to his degradation at slope number 12. In 1908, the testament to the pall progressing over American black lives, but his voice and that of millions of others is almost entirely absent from the vast records of the era. Unlike the victims of the Jewish Holocaust, who were on the whole literate, comparatively wealthy, and poised to record for history and the horror that enveloped them. Cunningham and his peers had virtually no capacity to preserve their memories or document their destruction. The black population of the United States in 1900 was in the main dispute and illiterate. For the vast majority, no recording, writings, images, or physical descriptions survive. There is no chronicle of girlfriends, hope, or favorite song of the dead in the frat mine burial fields. The entombed there are utterly mute. The fact of their existence as fragile as a scent in the wind. That silence was agonizing frustration in the writing of this book, especially in the light of how richly documented were the lives of the whites most interconnected to these events. But as I shift more deeply into the fragment details of an almost randomly chosen man named Green Cunningham and the place and people of his upbringing, the contours of an archetypal stories gradually appeared. I found the facts of a narrative of a group of common slave owners named Cunningham and common slaves who called themselves virgins of the same name. Of the industrial slavery that presaged the forced labor of a quarter century later. Of African American ancestor names Sicklefoot, who had been thrust into the foreigners of the antebellum South, of the family he produced during slavery and beyond, of the roots of the white animosities that steeped the place and the era of Green Cunningham's birth, of the obliteration forces that levered upon him, a generation and generations of his family. Still, how could the account of this vast social wound be woven around the account of a single animositous man who, by every modern measure, was inconsistent and unvoiced? Eventually, I recognized that this imposed animosity was Green's most authentic and compelling dimension. Retracing the steps from the location of the prison at Slope 12 to the boundaries of the burial field, considering even without benefits of his word, the shifted horror he and thousands of others must have felt as they descended through the now low passageway to the mine. I came to understand that Cunningham belonged as a central figure of this narrative. The slavery that survived long past emancipation was was an offense permitted by the nation, perpetrated across an enormous region over many years and involved thousands of extraordinary characters. Some of that story is in fact lost, but every incident in this book is true. Each character was a real person. Every direct quotation come from a sworn statement or a record documented at the time. I tried to tell the story of many places and states, and the realities of what happened to millions of people. But as much as practical, I chosen to orient this narrative towards one family and a descendant, to one section of the state, most illustrative of the breadth and injury, and to one forgotten black man, Green Cunningham. The absence of his voice rests at the center of this book. Part 1. The Slow Potion. The Wedding. Fruit of Freedom. Freedom wasn't yet 3 years old when the wedding day came. Henry Cunningham and Mary Bishop had been chattel slaves until the momentous final days of the Civil War. As nameless in the eyes of the law as cows in the field, all their life they could no more have obtained a marriage license than purchase a horse, a wagon, or a train ticket to freedom in the North. Then a final furious sweep of Union soldiers in a bewildering blur of liberation and terror unleashed from a distant war ravaged the Cahaba River Valley. Henry was suddenly a man. Mary was a woman, a slave girl no more. Here they stood, bride and groom, before John Wesley Starr, the coarse old preacher who a blink of an eye before had seen his Sunday teaching white people that slavery was a manifestation of a human order ordained by God, and preaching to black people that theirs was a glorious place among the chickens and the pigs. To most people along the Chaba River in 1868, hardly seen as impetuous to Mary. It was raw, cold, and hungry. In every direction from the Cunningham loop, the simple dirt road alongside which lived 3 generations of former slaves and their former owners. And the land its horizon were muted and bitter. The valley and a dead hills of Bibb County, even the bridges and fords across 100 yards wide Chaba, sweeping down from the last foothill of the Appalachians and into the flat, fertile plains to the south, were still wrecked from the savage cavalry raid of Union General James H. Wilson. Just 2 springs earlier, in April 1865, his horsemen had descended on Alabama in billowing swarms. The indefatigable Southern Army defending the state scattered before his event. Even the great Confederate cavalry, Genius Nathan Bedford Forrest, his regiments evacuated for 4 years of war, was swept aside with impunity. Wilson crushed the last functioning industrial complex of the Confederacy and left Alabama in a state of complete chaos. Now, 3 years later, the valley remained a twisted ruin. Fallow fields, burned barns, machinery rusting at the bottom of wells, horses and mules dead or lost. The people, black and white, braced for a hard, anxious winter. From the front porch, Eliza Cunningham's house, 2 stories stacked of hand-hewed logs and chipped with red clay dug at the river edge. The old man looked out on his portion of that barred vista. The land had long ago lost nearly all remembrance to the massive exuberance of the frontier forest he stumbled upon 50 years earlier. Now only the boundaries of contours remain of its carefully tended boundaries of the last year before the war. He had picked this place for the angle of the land. It unfolded from the house in one long sheet of soil, falling gradually away from his rough-planted front steps. For nearly 500 yards, the slope descended smoothly toward the deep river, layered when Eliza first arrived with a foot of fertile humus. On the east and south, the great field was hemmed in by gushing creek, boiling up over a turtle shell shape of limestone protruding from the banks, growing deeper and wider, falling faster and more furiously, strong enough to spin a small grist mill, before it turned to the west and suddenly plunged into the Chabbah. He named the stream Cunningham Creek. An abounding sense of possibility exuded from the place Eliza had chosen, land on which he intuitively knew a resourceful man could make his own indelible mark. Yet in the aftermath of the war, Eliza Cunningham, like countless other Southern whites in 1868, must have felt some dread sense of an atomized future. They knew that the perils of coming times constituted a far greater jeopardy than the war just lost. A society they had engineered from wilderness had been defeated and humiliated. The human livestock on which they had relied for generations now threatened to rule in their place. In the logical spectrum of possibility for what might yet follow, Eliza had to consider the terrifying and ultimately realized possibility that all human efforts invest at the confluence of Cunningham Creek and the Chabbah River would be erased. The authority that infused their achievements was lost. More than a century later, the last Cunningham would be gone. No trace of the big house, the slave cabin, or the water wheel would survive. None of the fields hacked from the forest remained at plow. On the creek and some beach gravestone clustered atop the hills still bore the Cunningham name. Eliza had arrived at the bank of the Chabbah barely a man himself, and in Alabama territory that was still untamed. In 1817, and Eliza and his 3 brothers faced a dense wilderness governed by the uncertainties of Indian territory and the vagaries of an American nation debating the precept of immense domain that would ultimately expand its border from Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Alabama would not be a state for 2 more years. Elijah's brother Charles soon decamped to the newly found county of Centreville, where in short order shallow draft riverboats would land and a trading center would be established. Another brother, William, moved farther south, but Elijah and his younger sibling John stayed in the wilderness of the Chabad. In the fourth decade before the Civil War, they stacked out land, bought in wives, cleared the lush woodland, sired bountiful families, and planted season upon season of cotton. The engineers of their enterprise were black slaves. In the earlier years, they imported them to Alabama and later bred more themselves, including Henry from their African stock that they brought at an auction, or from peripatetic slaves, pelters who arrived unbidden in springtime with traces of ragged, shackled black man and woman carrying signs advertising Negroes for sale. Manning Farms, strung along a looping wagon road, the brothers and their slaves cleared the land, raised cabins, and built the church where they would pray. Harnesses and their black labor to the rich black land, the Cunningham brothers became prosperous and comfortable. Some neighbors called the Cunningham section of the county Ferry, for the man who lived on the other side of the Chabad and pulled a raft across the water for a few pennies a ride. But the Cunninghams, God-fearing people who gathered a congregation of Methodists in the wilderness, almost as soon as they had felled the first timber, adopted for their homestead a name marking the works not of man but of the Almighty. Where the clear Cold Creek grew in the Chabad, a massive bulk of limestone rose from the water, imposing itself over a wild, sweeping curve in the river. To the Cunninghams, this place was riverbed. The Cunninghams demanded a harsh life of labor from their bondsmen. Otherwise, what point was there to the tremendous investment required for owning slaves? Yet, especially in contrast to industrial slavery that would eventually bud nearby, life on the Cunningham plantation reflected the biblical understanding that cruelty to any character was a sin, that black slaves, even if not quite man, were at least thinly made in the image of God. Set among more than 20 barns and other farm buildings, Henry and the rest of the slaves lived in crude but warm cabins built of roughly logged chipped with wood. Heat came from the rock fireplace with chimneys made of sticks and mud. Elijah recorded the ownership of 13 slaves in 1860, including 4 men in their 20s and 30s and 6 others male teenagers. A single 20-year-old female lived among the slaves, along with 2 young boys and a 7-year-old girl. Given the tradition of isolated rural farms, Elijah's grandson Oliver, raised there on the Cunningham farm, would have been a lifelong playmate of the slave boy nearly his same age named Henry. When Elijah Cunningham's daughter Rebecca married a neighbor, Ben Battle, in 1852, Elijah presented to her as a wedding gift the slave girl who likely had been her companion and servant. In consideration of the natural flavor and affection which I bear to my daughter, Elijah wrote, I give her a certain Negro girl named Frances, about 14 years old. Those slaves who died on Cunningham's place were buried with neat ceremonies in plot marked by roughly unlabeled stone, just a few feet from where Eliza himself would be laid to rest in 1870, clearly acknowledged by the Nas as members in some manner of a large human family recognized by the master. Indeed, Eliza buried his slaves nearer to him by far than he did Reverend Starr, the man who ministered to all of the souls on the Cunningham plate. The Starr family plotted with its evangelical inscriptions and sad rooster of infant death was set down on the hill and towards the road, even more vulnerable to the creeping oblivion of time. Long generations hence, descendants of slaves from this plantation still recounted a vague legend of the generosity of a Cunningham master, giving permission to marry to a favored mulatto named Green. That slave who would remain at Eliza's side past emancipation and until the old master's death would become the namesake of Henry and Mary's younger son. But even as Eliza had allowed a strain of tenderness to coincide with the brutality subscribed lives of a slave, he never lost sight of their fundamental definition as cattle. They were creatures bought or breeded for the production of wealth, even as he deeded to daughter Rebecca the slave Frances. Eliza was careful to enumerate in the document the recognition that he was giving up not just one slave girl, but a whole line of future stock who might have brought his cash or labor. Along with Frances, Eliza was careful to specify his newly wed daughter receiving all future increases of girls. The marriage of Henry, now 20 years old, and Mary, 1 year his junior, in 1868, was the first among Cunningham people, black or white, in 2 seasons. Another slave, Albert, had wed and left for good in the middle of the first picking time after the destruction of the war. Amidst the chaos, the uncertainty when no one could be sure slavery had truly ended, Albert didn't wait to find out. Now, 2 years later, the coming marriages surely named Eliza at some level. But as Henry prepared to take a wife and become a man of his particular new era, everything the old white man had forged, everything on which that gift to his daughter 20 years before had been predicted. Hung in the fragile limbo of a transformed social order. Whatever satisfaction the vital ties gave the white master at the wedding of his former bondsman would have been tempered by the poverty and grief that had overwhelmed him. Most of Eliza's slaves remain nearby. Some still work his property for wages or a share of cotton crop. But the end of the war had left the white Cunningham at a point of nearly desolation. The hard winter threatened to bring them to their knees. As Henry and Mary's wedding approached in 1868, whites crossed the southern strain to accept the apparently inevitable enmity descending from the war. The loss of fortune, the war, blood, and sorrow, the humiliation of Union soldiers encamped in their town. All these things white had come to bear. They would bear them a little longer, at least until the instant threat of hunger and military forces receded. But these abominations paled against the specter that former slaves with their huge mathematical majority in Louisiana, Mississippi, southern Alabama, South Georgia, and South Carolina would soon vote and rule government and perhaps take their master's land. This vision was a horror almost beyond contemplation. It poisoned the air for Elijah and other white landowners with prospects for even greater disaster. In the last days of fighting, the U.S. Congress had created the Freedmen Bureau to aid the South's emancipated slave. New slave gave the agency the power to divide land confiscated by the federal government, and to have no more than 40 acres of such land assigned to freedmen and black war refuge for a period of 3 years. Afterwards, the law said former slaves would be allowed to purchase the property to hold forever. President Andrew Johnson recited the provision a few months later, but emancipated slaves across the South remain convinced that Northern soldiers still garrisoning across the region would eventually parcel out to them all or part of the land on which they had been told. The threat that Elijah's former slave would come to own his own plantation, that he and his family would be landless, stripped of possession, and outnumbered by the very creatures they had bred and raised, was palpable. The last desperate rally calls of the Confederacy had been exhortation that a Union victory meant the political and economic subjugation of whites to their black slaves. In one of the final acts of the Confederate Congress, rebel legislators asserted that defeat would result in the confiscation of the estate, which would be given to their former bondsmen. Already 40,000 former slaves had been given the title General William Teichmann's chairman to 400,000 acres of rich plantation land in South Carolina early in 1865. It was unclear whether blacks would be able to retain any of the property, but rumors flared anew among blacks across the South the next year in the Christmas time. The end of the annual crop season, that plantation land everywhere will soon be distributed among them. The U.S. Congress debated such a plan openly in 1867, and it drew up the statutes to govern Reconstruction to the southern states. And again, as the harvest time ended that year, word whipped through the countryside that blacks would soon have land. At one point the following year, in 1868, during the period of intense speculation among free slaves, that land was soon to be provided to them. Many blacks purchased boundary markers to be prepared for the marking of their own 40-acre tract. 40 miles to the west of the Cunningham farm in Greene County, hundreds of former slaves filed suit against the white slave owners in 1868, demanding that the former slave masters be compelled to pay wages earned during the prior season's work. Whites responded by burning down the courthouse, and with all 1,800 lawsuits filed by the freedmen. Despite Big County's remote location far from any of the most famous military campaigns, the Civil War had been a distant event. In the early months of fighting, Alabama industrialists realized that the market for irons sufficient for armaments would become lucrative. In the South, in 1860, only Tredegar Iron Works, a vast industrial enterprise in Richmond, Virginia, driven by more than 450 slaves and nearly as many free labor, could produce battle-ready cannons for the South. The Confederate government also, from the moment of its creation, set out to pour additional capacity to make arms, particularly in Alabama, where a nascent iron and coal industry was already emerging, and little fighting was likely to occur. During the war, a dozen or more new iron furnaces were put into blast in Alabama by 1864. The state was pumping out 4 times more iron than any other southern states.